November 2012. This is session 5.
Humility.
Yeah, sure. So then for this person who's not humble, who's seeking to avoid a lot of things through getting glory and attention, what effects can it have on the people that they are interacting with? You mentioned that there can be this addictive relationship form, but say with children or other people in their environment, what kind of things does it create?
Well, generally the people who are seeking these kind of emotions are very narcissistic. They have a very self-absorbed life and lead a very self-absorbed life. So if they have children, for example, the children will feel very neglected and not very honoured, and often the children will grow up with exactly the same emotion, of course, that the parent now has been seeking all of its life. And the sad thing about it is that these kind of people generally can't hold relationships well, they can't hold friendships well. You know, everything in their life aside from the glory or attention or approval they get is pretty much a mess. And this is why many people who have very public lives have very messy private lives, because there are a whole heap of addictions supporting their public life that they don't get met in private. And so oftentimes there's a lot of unhappiness in their life, which then causes them to seek even these things even more, and eventually they finish up, oftentimes when they pass, by the time they've passed, they feel very alone, because the reality is very few people can support them, emotionally support them throughout their life. It's very hard for a narcissistic person to continue getting friends, more, new friends, and chewing up friends, like they're going out of fashion, without sooner or later ending up with very, very few friends as a result. Or people who are just friends because of some addiction that is met.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned earlier about the example of the narcissistic singer, and you were saying those kinds of people are quite unpleasant to be around. And it occurred to me that that's because you don't want to enter an addictive relationship with them, so you feel it as a demand or an oppressive feeling to be around
Whereas
them.
their fans would love to be around them.
Yes.
Because there would be a codependent addiction that gets met inside of the fans, by having some kind of association with that person. And so their fans would actually feel very different to what I feel about being with the same person.
And that led me to think about a child of that sort of a person. They obviously don't enter the world seeking an addictive relationship, so they must also feel quite similar.
They will feel very similar. The child will find it very difficult to have a relationship with that person. Very difficult to have a fulfilling relationship.
And I imagine feel quite oppressed.
Also neglected, unloved, unwanted, uncared for. Yes, many, many different emotions. And this is why many of the children of people who have been wealthy, powerful, or popular have a lot of deep grief to go through before they can become stable emotionally.
Yeah. And is that also why we often see substance abuse in those kinds of situations?
Yes. Substance abuse is often a result of, it's another layer of adding physical addictions to the process, besides the emotional
and
addiction.
avoiding the oppression of the parent or the situation.
Trying to avoid the oppression of the parent, so you want something that helps you avoid the emotion of how unloved you feel, how unwanted you feel, how pushed around and powerless you feel in the relationship.
Okay. So it sounds like in this set of resistances to humility that we only give of ourselves under very specific conditions. If I was a person in that state, is that true?
Yes, a person who's seeking power, glory, attention, position, approval is only ever going to give in a situation where they'll get those particular things. So in other words, it's a bartering system, an emotional bartering system that they enter with every single individual. And if you're not prepared to enter the barter with them, you'll never be their friend. That's the reality. They cannot love you, and they do not love anybody, actually. They only love the feeling of power, position, glory, attention, approval. That's what they love. So similar to how a person who's living in fear is made fear their God, then a person who's living in these things has made these things, glory, attention, approval, their God.
Yes.
And they'll do anything to get that glory, attention, approval. It's impossible to have a relationship with integrity with such a person, because they will always sacrifice the relationship for some kind of attention, approval, or power. And so it's impossible to have a fulfilling long-term relationship with the individual unless you're totally willing to do exactly what their addiction demands.
Yeah. So if I had this set of injuries,
Mm-hmm.
what would I need to do in order to reach a state of humility?
Well, they have very difficult injuries to release again to get to a state of humility, because the addiction is usually firmly in place by the time the person's become an adult with these particular problems. Their world around them is trying to loosen up this problem and help them to feel it. But unfortunately, the addiction is demanding, no, I want to only create a life that will give me these particular results. And so it requires a lot of sincerity on the part of a person who's living this kind of a life to actually break down through this layer of fear, through the addiction, and into the layer of fear that they have about feeling the underlying grief, the fear about feeling the grief of powerlessness, the fear about feeling the grief of being unwanted, the fear about feeling the grief that nobody notices me. These kind of powerful grief from our childhood. Of course, there are also positions of untruth, in the sense that the irony of life is that when we feel a sense of internal worth, we won't seek the worth externally. When we feel a sense of internal power, we won't seek the power externally. When we feel a sense of internal glory, where we honour ourselves, we won't seek honour and glory externally. And so, in the end, there is this healed position that we have to reach, emotionally healed position, where we have a feeling or a sense of internal power, a sense of internal worth. And these particular feelings only come when we release the opposite, when we release the opposite feeling that created this driving desire for these particular emotions to be fulfilled.
So it's really acknowledging a lot of truth from what you're saying. We need to at least open up to the fact that there's a different truth about what's...
Yeah, and unfortunately, most people who are in such a condition don't open up to the truth until they've created a life that's been quite damaged. And then they come to recognise some of the truth about how they created this damaged life. And they then have some kind of self-reflection. They have some kind of therapy or some kind of psychological help which helps them see the reason why they had such a desire for glory, for example, and the sacrifices that they were willing to make of their own self and others to reach this pinnacle of glory. And then once they start seeing that, they start seeing the emotion as a drug, rather than just seeing the emotion as something that's good to have. So they start seeing the emotion as a problem that has caused the majority of their underlying problems that have been caused through this addiction. And then they start working their way through it emotionally. And it's rare for a person to consciously see that, I'm seeking power, and then to consciously work their way through their fear and into their grief of how powerless they feel, without there being some kind of negative external effects in their life first.
Yeah, because we've given the example of someone seeking fame and glory in the big wide world. But I also see that many people set themselves up in positions of power, glory, respect and value in terms of their own family. They're the head of the household, they're the father, the mother, the wise old grandparent who has really created many of these things in a way that perhaps gives them less feedback about it.
Yes, and unfortunately, we were in Brazil recently, and both of us noticed there, didn't we, the power of the mother, the matriarchal system there, where the mother believes that everyone in the family has to eventually basically just do what she says or do what she wants, and
she's glorified.
And she's glorified as this beautiful woman as a result of that. And the reason why is that she has inculcated into her children this very, very strong desire to please her. And so now nobody in her immediate environment confronts the desire generally, because they all know that if they confront the desire, mum's going to be an angry ogre who might finish up excommunicating them from the family if they're not careful. And so they always get themselves back into line. Now, such a person has no consciousness or awareness of how much what they are seeking through those addictive relationships. And they, like I said, they need to come to some personal awareness that such behaviour is unloving and uncalled for, actually, in a family. And then they need to go through this process of opening or becoming more aware that these emotions are driving them, and what the underlying reason for the emotions driving them are. Now, of course, for a person to do that, they've already got to be fairly humble. Before they can actually go and do something like that, they have to have some degree of humility to look at themselves. And it's rare for such a person to do that. And, you know, when we were in Brazil, we talked to some spirits who had passed into the spirit world, and I asked them where their families were, and they couldn't find them. And so what they did was they adopted another family on Earth so they could do the same thing to it, not asking themselves the question, why has my family deserted me? They've all passed. Like, why have my family deserted me? Well, don't you think it's got something to do with how oppressive you are? And once we started talking about that with that group of spirits, and sort of taking them through the process of what was actually happening, there was initially a lot of resistance, just like there would be with people on the earth in the same condition.
And so really the family is a place where we might breed these kinds of addictions in ourselves or in our children. I'm thinking now of the favoured child, the golden child, or the long-wanted child, or the child that suddenly they're born and they're already given a lot of power, attention, and glory. And
many of these golden childs grow up being very narcissistic, doing some very damaging things. Some even turn to rape and murder and other very damaging actions as a result of their, you know, being treated with this, you know, favoritism that is developed within them.
So it's going to take a lot of humility for someone to really begin to look at themselves and look at what is the attention that others are giving me. Does it give me a sense of feeling glorified or superior? And or I suppose, what are the results in my family? If I've had a family, do I have children who do substance abuse or are finding it difficult to live in their life? They would be maybe some of the indicators I would look for, would you say? But
also, I feel in these situations, you get this sort of situation where you feel a person who is truly humble feels a sense of when they're being honoured for something they have actually done, or whether they're being honoured in a worshipful way.
Yes.
And there is a very, very big difference between this worshipful honouring or glory or attention or power than being honoured for what you have actually achieved. Now, a person who's humble will accept being honoured for what they have actually achieved, but they would reject being honoured for things they have not achieved, right? And they actually would not agree with or enter into the codependent addiction emotionally for things that they have not achieved, right? And they'd also recognise the holes or the problems that they have in their own life or their own family or whatever it is as well. So when we're truly humble, we may receive honour, but it will be for what we've actually done, not for what everyone imagines we've done, right? Or not for what everybody thinks we've done without any assistance. And we'll honour the assistance we've received as well, if we're truly humble. So there are ways to see whether the honour that we're receiving or the glory or attention or approval we're receiving is actually based around a real emotion or whether it's based around some kind of addiction. When we become truly sensitive and humble, we'll actually feel the dishonourable addiction as a very sleazy feeling that we're being drawn from or taken from in the interaction, and we will find it very difficult to engage.